Hello everyone, welcome to From No to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me today is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. If there's a topic you'd like us to cover on the show, feel free to email us at fromnowheretonothingpodcast@gmail.com or contact us on our Facebook page. Today, we're going to talk about something that people love, hate, fear, take pride in, or even identify as the primary component of their self. Anyone who has ever been to a social function knows to anticipate that it'll be the first thing they're asked about right after giving their name. And there are good, or at least mitigating, reasons for all of this. You will likely spend more of your life doing this than anything else, except for sleeping. We're talking about the complex, idiosyncratic, and yet universally recognized concept of work.
That was an elegant way to begin.
Yeah, and so we did a lot of talking about work before the episode even started. And I'm sure that this will all pop up. But yeah, I think when a lot of people hear work, they think about occupations, and it's more than that. And we'll talk about that as the episode goes on. Mm-hmm. But we'll start with, what is work?
Well, let's start with definitions and then tear them apart. Work is the fulfilling of duties for a paycheck. Well, work is performing a task that requires effort at a sustained level for a certain amount of time in order to finish a project. Work is repeated operations in order to contribute to a larger fabrication of something. I was thinking of your factory for that, or jobs my mother used to have. Work is engaging with, see, this is where it gets all frayed, engaging with something in order to accomplish something and spending energy doing it. But the etymology of work all goes back to the negative. Pretty much revolving around the Protestant work ethic. That work derives from roots that mean, among other things, torture, excruciation, a variety of words like that, pouring into it. And I'm opening up all sorts of doors here, but that's the job, right?
Yeah.
And so one needs to think about, okay, I'll jump around among things such as pop culture. Well, what's work? Well, country music will tell you that's only if you sweat a lot and put in long hours. Politicians will engage with working Americans, meaning, but there's a lot of people who are not working Americans, which excises any thought of parenting, mental labor. Politicians often like to say working people, and what they're talking about is blue collar work, which is a phrase that's going away now too. So the attempt to quantify it or to stultify it or to freeze it is like freezing light. It is such a nebulous term.
Yeah. That's a great overview, as usual. And we're going to touch on a lot of that at various parts in the episode. But yeah, it's interesting, right? I think that when doing the intro, talking about all the different things that work means to people, I think that for almost all of us, it means all of those things at some point, right? I can think of even within the same job, times that I've loved it, times that I've hated it, times that I've feared having to go in, times when I've taken pride in it, and so it's obviously, just by that metric alone, a very, very complex phenomena.
Yes.
And the fact that, yes, in social situations, that's going to be the primary thing that people want to know.
And not even in social situations, to go back to almost infancy, the well-intended but really just knee-jerk kind of question that people ask kids is the start of the sociological, ideological training. We have states like Florida saying we can't ideologically train our kids. We all ideologically train our kids one way or another. All systems do. It's an ideological training to say, what do you want to be when you grow up? Because that is, without even recognizing it, some folks, I'm sure, that is bringing ontology into it and suggesting that work is your identity. And there's nothing more unhealthy than totally fusing identity with work, because it suggests that's all we are.
Yeah, it's really funny, right? Because it comes down to just one word. What? If you said, who do you want to be when you grow up? That would be a totally different. What implies a product, like an end state of a process, right? What do you want to be when you grow up? And that it's commodification almost of your life at a very young age.
And then we get to the parties, as you talk about, and say, oh, what's your work? What do you do? And I love it when I've heard you on other podcasts. I'll listen to these, and well, I do this, and I do this, and I do that, and I do, because you do. And in none of it do you say, I am this, wholly, inevitably, and without end. Because you're not.
Yeah.
And most of us aren't, and yet we are constantly those of us who are talking this way are constantly pushing back against the notion that we should just, like in some kind of matrix coffin, lie there and be this one thing, a battery for a machine, a generator for a company.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and as a matter of fact, in my case, I don't feel like I've dedicated enough time to any of these things to even be worthy of the title. People, oh, so you're a musician, huh? Yeah, no, not really. Like I mess around with musical instruments when I have time, but I do so many other things that I don't really think of myself
as makes you
as
a musician.
Being a musician.
Yeah, see, you resist even though you know.
Yeah.
If you're not a musician, putting out a CD every year and engaging in your music rather regularly, who is? I mean, but that's because we have this constant binary opposition for so many things in our culture. And one of them is we say one thing and we mean the other. People pretty much have disowned or denigrated education. So you don't want to be a teacher. You want to be somebody who works, because after all, we all know that teachers don't even work all year long. Oh, yes, they do. Where do you think the ideas come from? Where do you think the research comes from? For choice of books, for curriculum, different ways to approach a classroom. That just doesn't all come snap out of your fingers. There's a whole planning process. And there is also time to step back and reevaluate. And everybody's workplace doesn't allow that in the same ways. But there's this implied competition of importance. If you work harder, if you're more at risk of your limbs, if you give fewer and fewer minutes to your family, well, then you're achieving the American dream. You're doing what you're supposed to. Work until you drop. I'm on a box about this, Joel. I love this topic because work is essential to us. We essentialize it because it is something we feel drawn to do, but not always. And John Locke and as you've probably read, Aristotle and John Locke, even though they lived many generations apart, were at odds about most of this.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's probably a good segue into the next question, but I just want to make one observation before we do, which is, when we were talking about how the negative, the etymology of work always tends to be negative, come from negative sources, right? What I find interesting about that is that if you sort of equate work to the rest of the natural world, right? The work is always happening, right? Animals, any animal you see, they work their whole lives, right? They wake up and they're trying to find food. They're trying to take care of their family. They're trying to do all of the things that humans do work in order to accomplish. And of course, it's a much more complex phenomenon with humans, but at a basic level, right? At a core level, if you ask most people why they work, it's usually to procure enough resources to provide for themselves and their families, right? Mm-hmm. And that in and of itself, if you take away all the other ancillary aspects of work, is not a fun thing, right? And it takes me back to sort of the Buddhist conception of life as suffering, right?
Yeah.
And when you look around at at the animal world or even the plant world, right? Anything that's alive, right? You are born and you struggle to grow into your primacy, and then you reproduce, and then you struggle to take care of your offspring, and then you die, right? And throughout the whole time, you work in order to make sure that those things happen. So it's sort of grim in that way, but we're going to get into some more complex aspects.
Yes.
So what does work look like throughout human history?
Well, I'll stay away from the strictly philosophical for a moment, and we can look at how we mark the transition from humans or proto-humans as nomadic to humans as civilizationally nascent and established is the idea of farming, the idea of agriculture. We all have been taught this, right? That when people settle down and cultivate a space, well, yeah, but then there are songs in musical theater about the farmer and the cowboy should be friends, and the nomad and the settled agriculturalist. But work across time, well, let's see, probably not much different than us. Farming, giving birth, thinking, fighting, choosing the verbs. Help me out. Flying, eventually. Painting.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that is the big one, right? When people talk about like the dawn of civilization, it's always the advent of farming. Yeah. And there's a weird paradoxical thing that happened there, right? Because on the one hand, it was all about food, right? The fact that you could sit in one place and produce enough food is what led to the development of civilization. But part of the reason that led to the development of civilization is because now not everybody had to worry about getting food
all day long.
Right. Now it became a specialized job. Farmer became a job, right? Up until that point in history, everybody's a hunter-gatherer, right? So we lived very much like the animals do, right? You'd wake up, you would look for food all day long, right? And you'd find things to eat and you'd find places to shelter. And that's what life was, essentially. With the advent of farming,
it was still hard work.
Certainly, yes. And it still is today.
Today.
But a smaller segment of the population was able to focus their efforts on creating food, which allowed a larger part of the population to focus on other endeavors like, how do I become better at building shelters in order for us all to have better places to live? How do we better think about how our community should be organized in order to develop a system of government?
We all become Promethean.
Yeah.
What fire can I bring to make humanity work better?
Yeah.
Even though it's not fire in a metaphorical sense.
And so that process is continuing to the present day. Really, I mean, if you look at it, the percentage of people who were farmers, even in 120 years ago, in 1900 versus now, has dropped exponentially, right? I think that if I remember right, with the last statistic I saw, was like in 1900, something like 80% of people were farmers. Mm-hmm. And today it's less than 2%. It's less than 2%. But the amount of food produced by those 2% of farmers is astronomically larger than the 80% of people produced before because of advents in technology, which are due directly to the greater proportion of people that do not have to farm for a living going into fields that develop knowledge that increase the efficiency of farming.
Right. So when people talk about our county, Wyoming County, being an agricultural community, I was challenging somebody on that the other day because the statistics show that in Wyoming County, it's not a huge percentage of people who are farmers. We have corporate farms, and a relatively small number of people own an incredible amount of farmland and hire and use lots of people. But that spreads out into parts shops, tools, equipment, medical, veterinarian. And so a huge segment is adjacent to farming, but in support of farming. But all of those other kinds of work go toward it, at least in this place.
Yeah.
So it's not simply farming, as if there were such a thing.
Right. And so I think it's helpful to sort of talk about the way that the modern economy is laid out when we're looking at how work is developed over history. So we have what's called the sector model of the economy, right? So your primary sector is the people that we've just been talking about, right? Farmers, people who make food, miners, people who get raw materials out of the ground. Basically, people who are working with raw materials. And then you have the secondary sector, which is people who manufacture physical components. They refine materials. So they take those raw materials, they turn them into something different. They provide utilities as well, right? So natural gas, oil, electricity power plants, and even jobs like mine where we're taking raw materials like rubber and copper and turning them into insulators for the power grid, that sort of thing. So you go from primary, so people who take things, raw materials from the environment. You go to secondary, people who take those raw materials and turn them into finished goods. And then you have tertiary, which provides services and administers things, so banks and other service-related industries. And then there's usually most models stop there, but there's also ones that look at a fourth sector that's knowledge-based, right? So education, right? That's this sort of thing, which is more amorphous, right? Because I think that so how do you separate the tertiary, right, from the fourth sector, quaternary? I think that a police would be tertiary, right? They're providing a service that sort of a service to the economy. Whereas, I don't know, education is different. Knowledge-based services are difficult.
Intellectually-based services are difficult. They are. I was just thinking of Plato's model when you're describing this. For him, there were three levels of work. At the top were the philosopher kings, the educated, the people who are supposed to know how to make things work in that societal sense. There were at the bottom, the laborers, and then in the middle, the governors, the peacekeepers, the military, the police, so to speak. So it's not unlike that model, but it's a little reversed. But you see, we take that sector model and we apply it metaphorically to places I don't think the metaphor necessarily belongs. I'm saying these things only to generate conversation. I'm not as, this is a given because I've said it, but in my observation, when you so often in education, to justify itself as if it needed to, which it doesn't, but the terms raw material and processing the raw material are used all too often to talk about students. Here's the raw material. We have to reshape it into something that we can sell. To reshape it into something that creates its own skills to sell. But ultimately, we're objectifying and capitalizing things that shouldn't be, even though the sector model has some very important accuracies for working with those materials. But students aren't uranium. They're not gold. They're not food.
Yeah, there's a better term, that's used in business lingo, right? That I think more accurately describes what education does, right? Which is value added, right? that's really what you're looking for. Education is the process of adding value to the human being, essentially, right? And you're right. I don't think that it needs to be justified because it's something that should be an inherent part of what we're all trying to do. But if you wanted to justify it, you could look at the example that was just presented a couple minutes ago of agriculture, right? Without any education, without learning anything new, everybody would still be farmers, right? We'd still be digging in the ground with shovels, right?
And not doing it terribly efficiently.
Yeah, you have to, the advancement of technology and the systemization of, developing new tools and building new tools and doing these sorts of things. We think of that as being, okay, well, that's secondary sector, right? That's taking raw materials and making them into finished products that help us further collect raw materials. But really, you don't have a secondary sector without not even a tertiary sector, because the tertiary sector, all they're doing is administering stuff. So you could look at a Stone Age civilization, and they have primary, secondary, and tertiary, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's that fourth sector, education, that moves the whole thing into the future, right? If you don't have people who are, again, to use business lingo for something that it is not, educators are essentially research and development people, right? They're people who are on the cutting edge of what we know and finding new things that we didn't know and finding ways to increase the efficiency of processes and get at, at things that we were unaware of before. And when you do that, you find new and better ways to administer the government in the tertiary sector, to build and optimize machines in the secondary sector, and different ways to, manage crops and find veins of ore in the primary sector. It all trickles down from that area. So yeah, does education, should we be using business lingo or should we have to justify it? No. But I think that you can, and it still works.
Well, I think you're using in those terms, it's much better than the raw materials.
Yeah.
Where and that's what John Locke was with in the late 1600s, just crashing slightly into the 1700s when he would argue, because it's a word we haven't brought up yet, but leisure. If you have work, you have recreation, and you have leisure. That's what Aristotle said. And Locke said there shouldn't be leisure. We should always be working. But what he meant was that he said you go out in nature and you can say, well, I really appreciate nature. Oh, look at those deer. Aren't they pretty? But until humans interact with them and apply labor, whether it's hunting, digging, shaping, whatever it is, then those things are essentially meaningless. We can see them, but they don't have use. He was very utility based. And so he was talking about, for instance, an aristocrat named Cincinnatus, who he uses an example. Cincinnatus is not a farmer, but he makes himself a farmer. He comes home and he farms, and he digs and he works at making bread from wheat, even though he doesn't need it for his table, even though it's not contributing to the economy, because it's causing him to think about problems and using rationality to directly encounter materials, and thus not in the space that he is in his day job, so to speak, with governance. And that by doing that, he's actually refreshing himself to be a better aristocrat. Because he was making the case that if leisure meant something, then aristocrats wouldn't go out and gamble and drink and party to excess.
Yeah, so that's an interesting perspective.
It's not often talked about with Locke.
Yeah. Before we dive into that, do you want to talk about other philosophers' views on work throughout time?
Yeah, although I think dwelling on Aristotle to Locke is probably the most useful.
Yeah, I think we should come back to that.
So again, Plato was the first person who really laid out what an economy would look like in a utopia, in the Republic. And since we call ourselves a democratic republic, people like to go back to Plato sometimes. And the telling thing is that in his tripartite vision, he doesn't count slave labor, which is vital to their conception. And so, as with all humans, well, slaves aren't people. And that's just egregious and ugly and it can't be defended. So it's not a great model, but it at least causes one to think about why it wouldn't be a great model. But it's really the first person who talked about work in that larger scale. And then his student, Aristotle, started to get at the relationship between work and leisure and recreation. For Aristotle, you couldn't have, you had work, whatever the work was. And the point of recreation is to refresh you to get back to that work. And if you didn't have the work, then recreation would be absolutely pointless because you don't, in his view, you don't recreate yourself just to sit and recreate yourself. You do it so you can do better work. But he separated leisure. Leisure is useless and it's pointedly and necessarily useless because leisure is where you, in his view, develop yourself just because. Locke said hundreds of years after that, nah, leisure is overrated.
Yeah, it almost sounds like Locke's argument might have been that recreation filled that role that leisure was supposed to.
He doesn't separate recreation and leisure. He doesn't.
What do you think about that?
What do I think about that? Well, here's the guy who's retired, who's doing podcasts, who's doing many different kinds of artistic work ad nauseum, who's been spending a significant amount of time with his grandchild as she develops. And I think that all of those things are vital to making me a better person. And I think without them, I'd feel lesser. And I was talking to a friend about this last night who I used to work with. In fact, it came up twice yesterday. My wife has told me before, some friends have told me that the difference with me and in the cohort of people in working, there are a bunch of us like this, I think, but I never defined myself by my work. Locke essentially would have you define your humanity by your work and how you improve your work. I'm oversimplifying. I know there's much more subtlety to it than that, but that's the essence. And as I understand it, and I think that that's wrong-headed, which is why I often clashed with my father-in-law. My father-in-law was a terrific man in many ways, but and he spent decades being a family court judge in the county. But he would come home after those days in court, and he would get on his tractor because he owned a very small little farm between Perry and Castile. Sometimes in his suit still, he'd be on his tractor and he'd be out plowing the fields and working at the peas. And he had a guy who ran his farm, but he was out there. He was Lockean. Mm-hmm. If we ever went on a vacation nearby to Silver Lake or something, a woe be unto you if you were sitting on the porch and reading a book. Because he said, but there's a tree out there that needs to come down. Man, and bringing down trees really gets to me. So let's get out there and do that tree. Oh, let's get under the porch and clean out the brush. Let's not sit and relax because that's being less than you could be. And so that's what I think. I think that we become better when we do things learn to do things that are outside of our wheelhouse, so to speak, and bring them into them and create a bigger wheelhouse, really. And then those things interact with each other and make us more conversant with other people. And there's certainly work. Anyone who tells you not being with a child is not work hasn't been with a child. It's wondrous work. It's lovely. I wouldn't ever forego it. But it's not simple. And this is the argument that women have had for so long. Oh, well, how, you're the mom or you're the housewife. And so what? You just do that because that's what you do. And there's still people who would like to go back to that limiting model. That's what I think.
Yeah.
How about you?
Yeah, I think that it's, I think that you put it very well, but I also think that you can identify how easy it is for people to fall into the trap of seeing it in a Lockean kind of way.
Oh, yes.
Because as you're describing your father-in-law, right? I'm thinking about the week that I've had and how there was a specific day this week, right? Where I woke up and I went straight to work, and then I went straight from work to a village meeting where I'm on a board and had to do something. Then I left and I came straight home. And then I was working out. I'm lifting weights in my work clothes, right? Business casual, pump and iron, right? Like your father-in-law on a tractor in a suit, right? Mm-hmm. And then going straight from there to do something else, and then straight from there to do something else until it's after my bedtime and coming home, right? And going to sleep. And so and by all measures, it was a good day. It was a good day for me, right? Everything that I did was engaging and, had some value and these sorts of things. And so when you're thinking about Locke's sort of illustration of the aristocrat and saying, okay, well, yeah, you don't need leisure. Like you just go home and you do something different. And then that different thing helps you sort of inform how to be better at your work. You go, okay, well, I can sort of see that. That kind of makes sense. But I think that it's missing the human component, right? I think where it goes wrong is the ends. It's not the means necessarily, it's the ends, right? And I think the Lockean ends are to create a better worker. Your identity is defined by the work. Whereas the Aristotelian model incorporates leisure and recreation and work in order to develop the highest level of a human being, right?
Yeah.
And so
I side with Aristotle.
Yeah. So I think it will vary with people, not just from person to person, but also for one person across their lifespan, what ratio of work, recreation, and leisure is necessary to reach your potential as a human being and inform how you develop.
Yeah.
But I think that they are all essential.
I think they are essential too. But when you just said that, it made me click to a turn onto a side route, which is still relevant. I think a litmus test for any person in our culture is to consider the model if you're at a family gathering or you're at a pub, a bar, or you a church, wherever you are, and someone comes up to you and says, well, what have you been doing today? Or a similar question. I know I felt this pressure myself too, because people start getting into what I call resume wars. Workday wars. So suddenly we're in this, the implied pressure is to outdo each other with how many things have we done in the day.
Right.
And I hear people doing this. And I've heard myself doing this somehow to justify my day at weaker moments and the societal pressure for this. So what is it? Well, I got the lawn mowed and it was a weekend. And so not only that, but I cleaned out my barn and then all this and then that. Mm-hmm. And then what have you been doing with your day?
Right.
I don't like that.
No. And I think that as a matter of fact, some of the things that make us the best human beings are what happens during leisure, right? The one that I come back to a lot is we've always gone on family vacations to the Adirondacks, right? And so my brother, when we go, he likes to do just one thing. He likes to sit on the front porch. He likes to read, right? Read books. And he likes to take some naps. And that's about it, right?
There I am.
Yeah. So, and every time we go up, it's usually mom, but dad was like it too. Well, why don't we go to Fort Ticonderoga? Well, why don't we go into Lake Placid? Well, why don't we go into here, there, the other thing, right? And so they're trying to stay busy. With me, it's always a balance, right? I'm here for leisure, right? So during this week, I want to read books. Now, I also want to take walks on the trail and climb some mountains and play some cards and I don't mind doing one big trip. Okay, we'll go to Fort Ticonderoga, but I'm not going to Lake Placid again, that sort of thing. But there's some balance there. But yeah, being able to just read a book, right? And for me and Amanda, Sunday is that day, right? If people ask us to do things on Sunday, we say no, right? And we don't even give excuses anymore. We can't do it because we're doing something else. Like, no, it's just Sunday and we're not leaving, right? We're gonna be here. We're gonna do the things that we want to do. And I think it's during some of those moments when you have the ability to sort of introspect and reflect on your other activities, right? If you don't have that moment of peace and quiet and silence to sort of look at the activities that you've been ceaselessly engaged with, then you have no way of identifying whether those activities have been productive or not.
Exactly.
And so
I think that's being comfortable in your own skin. And I do think we weaponize, probably mostly unintentionally, but I think we weaponize our activities as if we have to somehow validate how we've spent our time. We're our own arbiters. Nobody gets to tell us that unless we are in the workplace and we know what we have taken on. We've signed on for it. Sometimes the jobs aren't what we signed on for. But there's that contractual, capitalistic, transactional thing, right? That here's a contract. Here's what you're going to be doing. Or whether you're salary-based, whether you're wage, weekly salary, whatever it is, we're signing on to do a variety of tasks. Laborious sometimes, excruciating, travail, all those words, all those, thank you. I mean, it's traceable, in Western culture, I think it's traceable back to Genesis.
Yeah.
We would have had that life of leisure, but humans messed up. And so we're going to make it really hard. God makes it, you're going to have to scrabble and dig in the dirt. And you're going to have incredible pain to have children. And you're going to sweat. And it's going to be awful. And it's going to be for all time because there's no going back. And so, and I think that's where some of the weaponization and the punishment, all of that comes from. But no, ultimately, you and Amanda are comfortable in your own skin. You don't have to justify. But which means, though, there was a time earlier when you were a little younger and you felt like you did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you've hit on something important here, which is this idea of, work as being, how do we quantify what is reasonable and unreasonable difficulty, right? And so this in my class that I just did, I did a qualitative study based off of a video that a science presenter was giving on millennials in the workplace, right? And then went through and coded the comments on the video and separated them into people who agreed with the position versus those who didn't, and then found keywords of both positions and then distilled those keywords into general themes. And then from those themes drew conclusions off of, what qualitatively the interactions, the comments had with the video. And it was very interesting, right? Because what you saw is, and as you would imagine, I think that a lot of the commenters were drawn along generational lines, right? Most of the supporters are going to be Generation X or baby boomers, and a lot of the, dissenters were millennials and Generation Z people. But what you saw emerge, right, was a lot of the people who supported this notion that, millennials are lazy and they're technology addicted and so on and so forth. They see them as not having no work ethic, as being lazy, as being stupid, as being all these things, right? And then the millennials on the other side, or the dissenters, as it may be, because there's plenty of people that were saying, hey, I'm a baby boomer that owns a business and this does not represent my workers, but the people on the other side were saying, well, there's a lot of, there's some people that went on the attack, right? Well, really the older generations are responsible for the quandary that we are in. Mm-hmm. And, our money is not worth what it used to be. And we can't afford the things that used to come so easily to you, et cetera, as well as other people who, would say that the older generations are doing the same thing that the younger generations are, right? They're also complaining about the cost of living. They're also on screens, whether the screens be TVs or smartphones or what have you. And so, what's the difference and so on and so forth. But I think what the whole thing highlights, right, is this idea, and it gets to the essence of the philosophical question, right? Which is, what should we expect from work, especially when it comes to what should we have to put up with, right? Mm-hmm. How hard should work be? Are we entitled to have beanbag chairs and free food and nap time and whatnot, or should we have a bit of a stiffer upper lip because we're being paid to do something and the work itself is important, whether or not we identify it as being personally meaningful? Where do we draw the line on this? What do we expect?
And you've just hit on the essence of the quandary. And before the show, we were talking about what work is. If you define work and not categorize it and put it into, like I was purposely doing at the beginning, farming and swimming and policing and whatever. What is work? To do something for gain? I'm just putting out possibilities. I'm not staring at the dictionary, right? To engage in activities for others that will benefit them and yourself? Well, that's pretty broad. That doesn't necessarily mean a paycheck. It's not going to be volunteer work. Well, what if leisure is work? What if you are a trainer in a weight room? It's certainly work to engage with people. Maybe you love to do it. And so is it work? Must work have a negative connotation?
Yeah.
And I think we tend toward that.
Yeah. That's one of the questions I have on the list, which is, when is work not work, right? And so I like to think of myself as sort of being the perfect example of this, right? I just laid out one of my days, right? Where from the second I woke up until well after when I should have been to bed, I was doing things all day. But I was always doing things that I liked, right? I was always having a good time. And so was I exhausted? Yes. So had I worked hard during that day? Yes. Yeah. But there was no negative connotation to it. So does work need a negative connotation, right? I think that probably is pretty easy to say, no, I don't think that it does. I think you can work without it being negative. But you raised an even more interesting sort of anecdote, which is, does work have to be, does it have to be physical, right? If leisure is not something that comes naturally to you, right? You want to be busy, right? You sit down in a chair and all you can think about is cutting down that tree out there, cleaning out underneath the porch. What's work? Is work cutting down the tree and cleaning out the porch, or is work actually sitting with your thoughts for a minute and taking some deep breaths and
reflecting? For some people, that would be work, because it's onerous and even perhaps alien to your makeup, and so, yeah, the question, we're not going to answer it, but everybody knows this now. But we have to ask these questions in order to shake up what we think. I was raised in an environment with country music as the background, and I liked some of it. But with hard labor, well, that's not, because people like to use that with prison. So there's another, and every word we use can lead to something else. But physical labor. My dad's a mechanic. My mom worked in factories. She worked as a custodian. She worked as a cook. And all of that produces sweat and exposes you to conditions, especially in some factories that have holes in the ceiling and literally water is dropping in when it rains while you're working on a line. There were some local factories like that. So that was inhumane. And at the lower end of things, but nonetheless, can you work hard? And the transition that my parents made for me, or helped me make, but it took a long, long time because of the surrounding culture, was, yes, I do work hard, but I can work hard at something that other people don't interpret as being valuable and therefore not hard. And that's where this whole cultural thing comes in. This is where it gets really grim. When you think your work is better than somebody else's because you put yourself in danger all the time and make yourself ill and sweat blood for a paycheck that's not worth your labor, but you don't want to complain about that labor because that would be getting into things like unions, and we don't do that because that's not individualistic. So that whole Protestant work ethic, individual, do it or don't, there's some place for some of that. But when that becomes the driving factor, you turn work into something that nobody would want to do.
Yeah.
And why wouldn't young people say, are you kidding me? That's not the only way to be valuable.
Yeah, I think that the way that I see it nowadays is that the pendulum is, there's a pendulum that's swinging and it's always going past the point where it should be, right? But I identify with a lot of what you said, right? Because, okay, so I'm working on a PhD, which is a lot of mental labor. But at my job, I do a little bit of each, which is part of the reason I like it, right? So, but I've noticed a trend, right? If I'm working on the computer, nobody thinks I'm doing real work, right? And so they have no problem interrupting me. They have no problem asking me to do things or whatever. If I'm in the middle of like trying to wrench a part out of a press, or I'm relieving, so I'm running a press for somebody, nobody's going to come and bother you. Oh, okay, I can see you're busy.
Right.
So and so that brings me back to the example of your father-in-law, right? So if we're looking at this person and saying, okay, well, who's working? The guy that's cutting down the tree and cleaning out the bottom of the porch, or the guy that is sitting in the chair and, reflecting and on his experiences, even though that's more difficult than cutting down the tree?
And the answer is yes.
Yes. So that's where it gets interesting, right? So when we look at it that way, work is something that we are doing all the time in some way, isn't it? And I think that even going back to my talk about leisure time, right? Even leisure time, that the self-reflection and the sort of look at how all of your activities have been stacking up, and the choices that you make for yourself and for your future based off of how your life has been unfolding, even that is a type of work, right? Even if it feels less effortful, it feels less rushed and time constraint and physical, it's still a type of work, right?
It certainly is.
And so this brings me to the important part about the pendulum, right? Is so if everything is work, then what it highlights to me is that we have to find the meaning in the work in order to have fulfilled lives. And I think that's the problem with modern society, right? Is that you have people on one side who are saying you should just have a stiff upper lip and you're getting paid a paycheck and the world needs you to do this job, so just go out there and do it. And then you have people on the other side that say, well, I don't see any personal meaning in the work that I'm doing and I hate it. And it's much easier for me to not care about what's going on. And so I would rather do something easier, right? I don't think either one of those positions is right, and I think that it's something that I struggled through for a lot of my early adult life, but in the past few years I've started to find it. It's so easy. It's just a cop out to not care, right? And I see that with so many people my age and younger, where if you are dissatisfied with where you are in life, or you're dissatisfied with your position at your job, or you're dissatisfied with the fact that you don't have any hobbies, or you don't have a community to interact with, rather than putting in the work to get to a point where your life more closely resembles something that you want it to be, it's easier to say, well, I just don't care, and to not put in any effort, right? And I think that that's a mistake. And it's just as big a mistake to resign yourself to the 9-to-5 and to sell your labor to the highest bidder, regardless of what it is that you're doing, and to put up with institutionalized abuse. Neither one of
Charlie
those.
Chaplin going through the grinders and
neither one of those is the correct approach to work. Right?
No, so we seem to know what we mean by work, and yet, and I mean, because I think partly it's because we don't quantify it or qualify it in nearly the number of ways that we should. And so I try to think back to, okay, what's the really most basic way one might define work? So let's go to science. Let's go to biology or chemistry or physics. So what is a calorie? You remember the definition for calorie?
I think it's a unit of how much heat is produced when a unit is burned, I believe.
Yes. So are you burning calories when you're engaged in something? Well, then that's work by the most basic definition. You think, you burn calories. You operate a press, you're burning calories. So then are we going to determine, well, my work's more important because I burn more calories in an hour? Is that how we should measure it? I don't think so. And I'm not sure how you would. But I say that because I'm trying to point to the goofiness, almost the absurdity of trying to assert levels of work. And then we do all name kinds of drop. Well, in the pandemic, we gave so much lip service to what did we call the workers that we really needed, that we called, remember the label?
Oh, the essential workers.
The essential workers. What does that imply?
That they are indisposable as compared to other workers.
Yeah. And who were the essential workers? Do you remember?
Well, I was one of them. So it was mostly people that were making things.
Yeah. Also, including the people who were making burgers and fries.
Mm-hmm.
Good for them. It was one of those moments when you were essential. Well, they told you were. Did you get battle pay? Did you get extra kind treatment for doing the work under harsher conditions? Or were you just told, well, you're an essential worker until you're not?
Yeah, it was that one. And there was a lot of resentment among people in my factory that a lot of people that they knew were getting paid more money than usual to stay home and not work. And we were offered no special incentives to come in and do the same things that we had always done, except now you must wear a mask all the time and you must clean constantly and you must
get back in the early stage.
Yeah.
All right. And then we had the transformational moments when everybody who was at home wasn't not working.
Mm-hmm.
Zoom won and Skype lost. And still people trying to figure out how that happened. But some of us could try to do our work. Not that it was the primarily best way, but still working, and one could say arguably working harder, being available even more online for individual students, those kind of things. Teachers worked really hard. Some people acknowledge it and some people didn't. That's how it always is. But if you are at home doing the job that needs to be done the best that you can, you don't have a manager necessarily watching you, but you're getting it done. But you're getting it done with other things going on too. That's what scared part of corporate America. It wasn't that it might be impeding the work. It was that, oh, you mean you can do all this and I'm not watching you?
Yeah.
Oh, so what is the managerial class? And then it starts to bring questions like that. And now we have the great push to put everybody right back in the buildings because you've just got to be here. We need that zeitgeist. We need that culture of the company that we couldn't get if you were on Zoom. Well, some places can't. Your place couldn't.
Yeah, and I think that so that kind of comes back to some of the very basic like philosophy of mind, right? Like mind-body dualism, right? Okay, so part of that is that, you know, your body, what you do is in a public space. You can be observed and people can see you. But what happens in your mind is private. You can't be seen, right? And so I think that applies to mental labor as well. And so I think that it can be legitimately taken advantage of. And since it can, you're right. That is what creates paranoia in companies, right? Is, you know, because you can think like, okay, if you have a manager and your manager is really just not a great guy, he really can just slack off all the time and not be doing anything and then justify it as being mental work, right? He's doing, you know, and I think that's where this preconception that if you're working on a computer, you're not doing real work is because it's easier to hide if you aren't, right? But at the same time, doing mental work can be real work and it can be much harder than some physical work.
Absolutely.
And so, yeah.
And you're part of I wasn't slamming because you're part of the managerial class, but I also have a pretty fine notion of how you approach things, your work. But that thing with the keyboard and the computers, that's traceable right back to typewriters and secretarial work. Well, you could interrupt a secretary doing anything. Why? Because primarily it was women. And they're just typing after all. They're just copying things. They're just scribing. They're not generating anything except what I dictated to them. All of the terms that we use and have used. This is partly what Marx was talking about. And Engels, this is what people still talk about and need to talk about. Why is my work undervalued? And what is the value of my work really? And that's the core that a lot of people don't want to work at, because in the paradigm, the structure of our culture, we know that there are jobs that are rated higher in value than others. And the moment you try to devalue someone's labor, I think that's when you really go wrong. And it's what happened with why we have so many vocational problems now. We don't have education systems. There were many people within the systems that wanted to do this, but telling everybody that they needed to go get an education. Well, as soon as you say go get it, you're in some kind of capture the flag game that doesn't really describe what the process is. You are always getting an education. You never stop getting an education. But how many people are decrying the fact that we don't have enough plumbers and electricians and welders and so on and so forth? Well, that's the result of this. But why is that? Because we devalue physical work at the same time that people who do physical work sometimes say it's the only kind of work that is value. Well, if nobody else is telling you that it has value, you certainly have to assert the value yourself. But that can just go all bad too.
Yeah. So it's like I said, we're getting to the end of the episode and we have not answered the question. If anything, we've made it more difficult, right? But yeah, I think that is a big part of the problem is this: how do we reconcile what society and what value society places on our work versus what value we place on our work, and how do they interact? And usually the almighty dollar mediates that relationship, right? And I think that's the problem. Right? That's exactly what you're saying.
I agree. That's because questions are being asked. Of course, this isn't original, but we fall into a paradigm, or we are put into a box that the 40-hour work week is the only thing, 9 to 5. Dolly Parton tells us that. And why is that the best model? Well, it probably isn't. And we found that out in the pandemic.
It was an interesting thing. I think it's kind of a good way to wrap up the conversation on work is thinking about the future of it. Because Adam Smith, right? And a lot of the early economists were sort of notable for saying, hey, with the way technology is advancing, it's not going to be long before most people are working 12 hours a week,
Mm-hmm.
And we highlighted the illustration of farming, right? How, it used to be, hey, you'd work from sun up to sundown, 80% of people just to be able to eat. And sometimes there was still famines and sometimes there was still, problems. Whereas today, less than 2% of people do it. And food security is not an issue. Obesity is actually the issue, right? And, all of this is due to technological developments in whether it's, GMOs or, farm, tractor innovations or, satellite imagery or geology or all of these different things, right? Every single aspect of science and technology plays into making these things easier and more efficient. And before this episode, you and I were messing around with last week's recording. We had this terrible buzz through the recording.
You did.
And I spent hours trying to get it fixed and it didn't sound great. So if you listened to last week's episode, I apologize. I'm hoping this week's will be better. And if it does sound better, it's because I found an AI tool that does 3 times the job that I did in 1,000th of the time, right? And so when you look at this continued efficiency, right? We develop these tools. That's the reason we develop tools, right? Is to make things faster, to make things better, to make things cheaper, to free us up to do other things. What does the future of work look like, right? What happens to the value that we've placed on it? The fact that we've put it at the center of our identities, right? Do we just continue to find new, different things and what does this look like in 100 years?
That is a good way. That's a marvelous way to end this. We know that we're not sustainable. We know that our models are not sustainable. We know that we can't just keep digging stuff up and making things out of it, because sooner or later we're going to run out of the essential ores if we keep trying to do it the same way we've been doing it. And we know what happens. That's obvious to us all the way across society. So we need to think about it.
Yeah. So I'm sure that we'll be referencing this discussion in future episodes, especially I think next week we might be talking about commitment. I think that is a natural extension. So until next time, keep pondering.